This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. This Friday's programming begins with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us to provide commentary for this week's grain market update. He gives an overview on some of the latest data we've received from the USDA and the interesting dynamics currently playing out for corn, soybeans, and sorghum locally. Today's show continues with advice on mineral supplementation planning from K-State Cow-Calf specialist Jason Warner. He shares that now is a great time to evaluate the success of last year's plan and adjust accordingly. This week's programming concludes with an agricultural weather report provided by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip highlights the warm and windy conditions experienced by most of the state this week, as well as rapidly rising soil temperatures and the slight chance for precipitation in the week ahead. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien for this week's grain market update. And Dan, before we get into things, thanks so much for joining us today.
I appreciate the opportunity, Samantha. Thank you.
Absolutely. So last week we kind of ended teeing up for what we wanted to talk about first and foremost this week, and that's the USDA's prospective planning and stocks reports that were released. They were released last Friday, or I think it was around 11 a.m. So what all did we kind of see from those reports?
Well, there was some important information that came out, and the markets, of course, looked at them, and we've had some volatility in the last few days since that, some of it related to the findings of it. But overall, I guess, stand back and look at the broader picture of it, there were more corn acres than thought, less soybean acres. For wheat, not a lot of surprises other than lower hard red spring wheat acres coming in. Stocks were tight all the way around. Corn ending stocks as of March 1st, down 4.6%, and the number of years low that the corn stocks, soybean stocks, and others were, you'd have to go back and get a calculator and check out how many years it's been since we've been that tight. So generally, the stocks numbers came in, supported tightness in the markets, and no doubt, we're going to come in now to the April World Agricultural Supply Demand Estimates reports, and those tight stocks numbers will come in and be reflected in the current year's ending stocks. And frankly, we're about 1 month away from the May reports where the USDA starts to put out official numbers for the next marketing year. So we're looking at a tightening of old crop ending stocks, likely tightening up of new crop ending stocks, and stocks to use numbers that are not indicating, at least yet, of any rebuilding that would be occurring. And, you and I have talked about this at different times, even before we came on the air today, about the current state of the markets. And you wonder, with all the risks that are out there, why we are priced at certain levels. And there's just a number of issues that have to be dealt with. But these stocks and acreage reports are just, I guess, laying down a foundation now, especially on the planted acre side, that we'll build upon now as we go forth and start to deal with actual in-the-field crop production uncertainty in coming months.
One of the crops that I think of right now specifically that it's probably a key time for is wheat, I would say. And, you mentioned that there's a lot of wheat out there planted, but that doesn't mean that it'll probably be harvested. And that's very specific for us here in Kansas with the ongoing drought.
Yeah, for Kansas, we're shown to have 11% more planted acres of hard red winter wheat. And as you look from the Canadian border down to the Texas border, you see all those states have strong increases in planted acres with questions about how we'll actually be able to harvest a lot of those acres. For winter wheat, actually, in North Dakota, and there is some winter wheat in North Dakota, most of it's spring, up 23%. South Dakota up 12, Nebraska up 17. Again, Kansas up 11, Oklahoma up 7, Texas up 26%, and just strong questions about how many of those acres are actually going to be harvested, especially when you look at the drought monitor, latest set of drought monitor numbers, and see the dryness coming through much of Nebraska, through, of course, a lot of, well, I guess anything other than the parts of northeast Kansas and maybe some east central. Everything else has drought to varying degrees in it. Oklahoma, a lot of the wheat belt, panhandle, all pretty tough. Texas panhandle heading on down through a lot of their ag production areas, all not yet having seen the moisture that we're thinking is coming as we switch eventually here from La Nina to El Nino, all of that is still on the plate. I want to say something about that transition. I think that if ag producers are probably wondering about current corn prices, again, D's corn at $5.60 still very high, but about 40-50 cents below the highs of where we've been. November soybeans closing on Wednesday at $13.16 and current soybeans at $15.11. That would be the May contract. So you see those type of differentials. And pardon me for corn, it's just it said also May corn at $6.52, D's corn $5.60. So basically about 90 cents lower. May soybeans $15.11, November $13.16, just about $2, $1.95 lower. So clearly the markets are anticipating anything other than dry, tough conditions this summer and are showing that, are pricing that into the lower new crop bids. Those are still historically very good bids. But right now, I think the market narrative is that we see this weather change coming. We think things are going to be better. And until we start to see some type of evidence in the field that would shake that, we'll probably still have a pessimistic view of grain futures options as we head out in the coming months and weeks.
Sure. You just jumped into futures there. And I think a lot of the futures that we're currently looking at, a bit of interesting, dynamics going on. And I would say even our cash dynamics are even more interesting in terms of what we're seeing here locally in Kansas.
Well, yes, we are seeing grain sorghum reemerge as an export product. And in fact, in some of the main export-oriented markets, Topeka in particular, Topeka and Salina, you have as of, on Wednesday, April the 5th, you saw the cash bids for corn at $6.88, for grain sorghum at $6.92. Those were the top ones for elevators in those areas. New crop bids virtually equal at $5.31 for both. So for grain sorghum, which had been trailing behind corn for a while, that's really a change. For Salina, you've got sorghum cash prices, spot prices about $6.88, corn $6.97, new crop bids $5.46 for corn, $5.41 for sorghum. So again, pretty strong situation. And when I think of Salina and Topeka, those are good ag production areas, but they're strong export terminal locations. And so you're seeing that. And then you're seeing some strength for sorghum. And in the last several weeks, you've seen grain sorghum exports come on pretty strong. Even some elevators I drive by out here in western Kansas, suddenly there are piles of grain sorghum emerging, sitting on the ground beside them. And I think, well, where'd that come from? We haven't had grain sorghum for a while. Well, somebody's pulling grain sorghum out of storage, bringing it to these elevators, which can load train cars, and getting ready to send it down the road. So we see some evidence of this even out in the country of grain sorghum starting to move. And frankly, for our sorghum people, the timing is pretty good in that, we're coming up on planting. Do people plant corn? Do they plant sorghum? Well, when you have pretty strong competitive bids between those two in some dry areas, that basically aims us at both drought-tolerant corn and at grain sorghum. And then farmers choose which they're more comfortable with growing. So we'll see where all that goes in coming weeks.
Sure, yeah. Demand there driving some response, some movement from our sorghum producers here in the state. That obviously a great situation for them to be in, like you mentioned right now, with current planning when it comes to planting coming up soon, quicker than I think a lot of us anticipated. But we also have some interesting dynamics between feed grains and soybeans going on right now. I believe you mentioned that was in the futures market.
Yes, we're in an acreage battle, as we'd mentioned. And I know what the national numbers generally are when you look at new crop soybean futures versus new crop corn futures. And we have a break even of about 2.3 that we consider to be a neutral zone, I guess, between giving an incentive to plant corn versus soybeans. Interesting, we look around the state of Kansas at the Garden City area. When you look at the new crop bids, forward contract bids for fall, the ratio of new crop soybean bids to corn is about 2.0, well, clearly favoring corn. They have feedlots out there and ethanol plants. They're trying to keep that demand going. And that's the strongest of the corn signals. But when you start looking at the other side of it, here in the Columbus area, you have a ratio of 2.34. That would be slightly favoring soybeans. Topeka, 2.37. Salina, 2.32. So there you've got neutral to slightly favoring beans. For corn, you're still looking at Colby and Hutchinson areas slightly favoring corn. And the bigger picture of all this is that we're seeing a move towards the development announcements here of late in the region, talking about renewable biodiesel, renewable diesel coming into play, and plants being built to meet that. And it's a demand pull factor for acres. When ag producers see a new plant coming up there, they're planning to produce soybeans or corn to go in not just to livestock feed, but also to ethanol plants or soybean plants. And undeniably, we're not building as many ethanol plants right now as we are the oilseed crush plants. So I guess these economic forces in the state swing back and forth. At this time, we're swinging a little bit towards the biodiesel side and probably encouraging some soybean acres instead. Also, renewed discussion of canola that can be coming into the state. Well, that we can produce in the state. There's some plants that are considering crushing that, some plans in northwest Kansas to do that. So our crop mix is being affected by some of the processors that are coming into play and by some of the energy policies in the country that help to encourage those new fuels to come along.
Absolutely. Yeah, some interesting dynamics at play for sure. And as always, we'll find out soon, I'm sure, what's actually planted, the realities of that and how those will kind of play out. But hopefully we just get the rain to sustain whatever is planted here soon.
That is the big gorilla in the room. We can do a lot of things. We just have ag production in terms of bushels or hundredweights to actually feed these demands. And I think in the long run, we generally do best financially when we have really good yields and moderately good prices. A lot of times when we have just outstanding prices, well, we're really short on the bushels. So I think the balance over time is to have vibrant demand, have good quantities to feed that demand, and farmers still making money with both the quantity and the moderate price coming to bear and helping them out.
Absolutely. I think that's something we can all get behind here. But Dan, as always, thanks so much for joining us today and providing this great insight.
Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for our weekly grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we are joined now by K-State Cow-Calf specialist Jason Warner for a conversation on mineral supplementation for cow-calf operations. So before we even get into things, Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. How are you doing?
Good. Spring is in the air, and I couldn't be happier about it.
That's right. It's getting to be a good time of the year. We're moving into that time of year where we're starting to get some green growth on some of these pastures, and hopefully we continue to see that go as we progress through the rest of the spring and into the summer.
Absolutely. And as we're going into that season now's the time to be kind of thinking about this topic, mineral supplementation. So what really sparks that this time of year for producers? Why should they be thinking about that now?
So as we move into the spring, it's really an important time of the year because that's where a lot of critical decisions are made by producers on which products that they're going to use throughout not only the rest of the spring, but on into the summer months and the fall months as well. And so there's a lot of really important considerations and things to keep in mind with it at this time of the year. And also, too, I think this time of the year is really important for producers to go back and think about the products or the approach that they maybe used last year and look and see whether or not that was successful for them and be thinking about if they need to make some changes to their program. Now's a good time to be implementing that and discussing that with their feed supplier or their feed manufacturer that they work with to supply the product to them. And so now is just a great time to be having those conversations with their suppliers and making sure that there's good communication there as far as which products need to be implemented when and provided when, and that really has a lot of value for producers, I feel.
Absolutely. Yeah, taking the time now to reevaluate what last year held and plan for the year ahead. Great advice there. And when it comes to purchasing of mineral supplements, is there any price changes that we've seen? You know, we talk about price of inputs being so much higher nowadays. Has this affected mineral supplementation at all?
Over time, as with all other inputs that we see in production agriculture, we've generally seen the prices for those mineral components, those individual ingredient components, generally trend higher over time. We see some variations and some fluctuations, certainly, just regarding and depending on what supply conditions are at a particular time. But generally speaking, we've seen a general uptrend or uptick in those prices over time. And so I think really when you look at it with today's costs, it's important to come back and look at it. And I think that you can see that in most situations, we can easily have $40 to maybe $50 per cow per year in a mineral supplementation program, and even higher than that in some situations. And so that's why it's important to come back and evaluate the product that you're using and understand what its intended use is for. And it's a great opportunity, I think, to be having that conversation with your supplier and your provider about the product that you're using. And also this time of the year, it's important when we think about prices, because oftentimes by now, some producers will have already pre-purchased or contracted their product in advance for the product that they're going to use for this coming up season. But there would be a lot of situations where producers have maybe not done that yet. And so if producers maybe haven't already done that, now is a great opportunity, a great time here at the beginning of the spring season to be having that conversation with their provider and see if there's an opportunity to maybe bring that in as part of their operation and purchase that product in that type of manner and arrangement, because there can be a significant savings there if that's doable for both parties. So it's something to consider there for sure.
Absolutely. An opportunity to rework that balance sheet of sorts. And right now, as we're going into, I guess, second quarter. Are we midway through the second quarter of the year? Is that
starting it anyway?
Yeah,
certainly starting it. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So when it comes to further planning, when it comes to mineral supplementation, what advice do you really have for producers when they're crafting this sort of mineral plan?
I think the main thing is to think about what their goals and their objectives are with their mineral supplementation plan and the product that they're going to be using. I think it's really important for producers to truly read and thoroughly understand the product labels of the product that they're going to be using. I think that in a lot of situations, as I visit with producers, there's maybe a misunderstanding or misinformation there about what the product is and how producers can interpret that product and interpret that information. And it's really just important to understand what that information is and make sure that you're using a product that's designed properly and you understand what its intended use is. Certainly, if producers are going to be using any type of medication or medicated feed as part of their mineral supplementation program, need to be making sure they're having that conversation with their supplier and their veterinarian at the same time to make sure that we're properly formulating a product and using that correctly with its intended use and recommended and approved levels there. So now's a great time to be having those conversations and be thinking about what the approach there needs to be for certain situations that everyone has. And everyone's situation is a little bit different, and that's why thinking about this and in that manner is so critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were chatting before we went on air here, and just regionally across Kansas, there's so many differences that can affect what minerals need to be supplied to your cattle. Even water quality can affect it.
That can certainly influence it, and that's why it's important to take a look at it on a local basis. And if you can develop a custom mineral supplementation program that meets your needs and you have a good working relationship with a supplier or a manufacturer to develop and provide that product for you and they can do that in a quality manner, I think there's certainly a lot of advantages with that. One of the other things that we want to keep in mind with this time of year and especially now going into early spring is that for forages that can be suspect or forages that can pose a greater risk of hypomagnesia or grass tetany, we certainly want to be thinking about magnesium supplementation levels, particularly with lactating cows in those situations. And also, too, if fly control or a product to provide some fly control for your cow herd is going to be a part of your management program for this year, you certainly want to introduce those products or start getting them into that product so you can have consumption and intake of that product well in advance of peak fly season rather than waiting until midsummer. So those are some other important considerations that folks really need to be thinking about for this time of year.
Yeah, would you say those topics are kind of the areas that go maybe the most overlooked when it comes to some of this planning?
Certainly. And really, I think at the end of the day, when it comes back to looking at fly control products or also medicated feeds that are part of the mineral component, at the end of the day, we really have to come back and understand what our targeted consumption is. And we really need to make sure that on any product, regardless of the product that we're feeding, we want to make sure that we're doing a good job of accurately measuring and monitoring what consumption is on a group or on a pasture basis for a set of cows or a set of females that are out grazing. And it sounds simple, but it's really important for producers to do that, because if we're not accurately measuring consumption, and consumption is twice or maybe 3 times what the recommended rate is or the targeted rate is, then our cost is going to be 2 or 3 times what it's supposed to be, and certainly that can really add up really quickly. And on the other hand as well too, certainly we don't want to undersupply those products to those animals, and certainly that has greater importance if we're feeding a medicated product or we're feeding a mineral that has medication in it and fly control as well too, because the effectiveness of it will be less if we don't get the targeted rate in it. So it's really critical for folks to be managing their consumption or measuring their consumption and working to manage that as accurately as they can throughout the season and making appropriate adjustments if needed as they go.
You know, we talk about changing technologies across the industry on the show quite a bit when it comes to agricultural topics, and this might be one of the areas that gets forgotten, because there have been some changes over time when it comes to mineral supplementation, right?
There certainly have been, and when you think about mineral supplementation, we think about different sources of minerals, and particularly trace minerals that are going to make up the components of that package or that product. And so there's certainly differences there in the source and how those products are manufactured and what their rate of utilization or bioavailability and rate of absorption will be in the animal. So we see differences there, and that's why it's important to come back and look at the labels, understand what those products are, visit with your supplier or someone in extension on that if you have questions and you don't truly understand or you don't understand what those differences are, because there's differences in terminology and how products are worded when you look at labels, and that can certainly have different meanings in terms of what those products are. And so generally speaking, when we see those products that are more bioavailable to the animals, generally speaking, we'll see an increase in cost there. And so that's why it's important to go back and understand what the product is intended for and understand whether or not it's a good fit for your operation, and make sure that we're including that and feeding that to the right group of cattle in the right situation and at the right time of the year. That's really critical with that. So it's important to go back and understand what those differences are and make sure you clearly work through that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of the golden rule when it comes to, I guess, any product we use with our cattle specifically is, well, what does the label say? Consult that first and then formulate your question after that.
Absolutely. As with any input, it's important we understand what its intended use is for and make sure that we're feeding it at the appropriate rate and we're using it strategically within our operation.
Absolutely. Well, Jason, if listeners are tuning in and they have any follow-up questions potentially on mineral supplementation, where can they get those answered at?
KSUbeef.org.
Wonderful. Well, I'll be sure to link to that website in our show notes, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. But Jason, thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was our K-State cow-calf specialist, Jason Warner, joining us for a conversation on mineral supplementation for cow-calf operations. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're ending today's show with this week's agricultural weather report, as we always do. And joining us for that this week is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. So, Chip, thanks for being here.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this past week was windy and warm. I feel like that's the theme.
Well, that's what happens in the spring, right? We get warm, and when we get warm, we get really, really windy. We had some very strong, especially late last week. Friday, March ended on a big wind note with a lot of strong wind. We had measured close to 50 miles an hour in Manhattan and stronger elsewhere, especially to our south and east, which is abnormal. We don't typically see those kind of winds. But unfortunately, that led to some fires that erupted across the state. And thankfully, we didn't have more. We saw some brief cooler temperatures, but as we kind of went through the week, we were kind of offset the cooler temperatures with very, very warm temperatures. We had our first touch or get close to 90-degree mark in the Manhattan area. Get further south, they hit 90 as well, which isn't out of the norm, but definitely earlier than normal.
Sure, and with that comes rapidly rising soil temperatures, right? Yeah,
the soil temperatures skyrocketed in the last week. 7-day averages are well above 50 along the Oklahoma border now, approaching 60. And 50s are as far north as US 50 and even I-70 in a few places. So temperatures really went fast, and I know there's people planting, which is probably a little early, but that's the risk they take, I suppose.
Now we just need some rain to couple with that, and unfortunately, it's still fairly dry across most of the state.
Yeah, it's been very dry. The soils are just incredibly dry. Even areas that did get moisture over the last week or two, just very, very dry. We're not hitting our weekly averages even. And with the warmer temperatures and wind, we evaporate that moisture out of the ground really quickly. There is some subsurface soil moisture, but you got to get the root development first to tap into that. And that's going to take more moisture to get it started.
Is there any potential for that maybe on the outlooks in the week ahead?
Yeah, so overall things are going to average out below average for sure over the next week to even 2 weeks. But we broke the pattern. We had a very persistent pattern with southwest storms that kind of tracked to the north and east of us that took the rain to our east and snow to our north. That pattern is completely broken down. Now you've got high pressure building in with warmer temperatures, but what that brings with it is just kind of subtle chances of moisture now, not these big, huge storms. But that'll allow the opportunity for some weaker systems to slide through the region and hopefully bring isolated chances of showers. Periodically, it looks like Sunday for sure, especially in the south and east. And then as you get later into midweek next week, maybe western Kansas might get involved. But isolated stuff, if there's any localized downpours, they're not going to be widespread by any means.
Better than nothing, though, I guess, in this.
Yeah, we'll take a little drop of the bucket when we can get it. Anything we'll get, we'll be optimistic about. But maybe it's a trend as you look towards maybe longer term as a different kind of pattern gets established. I don't think we'll quite see exactly the same pattern we were in, and maybe some hope as we get towards the end of April and into early May of maybe bring in that spring moisture we've all been waiting for.
We've talked about warmer temperatures, and with that has brought wind, obviously. And April's the windiest month on record usually for us?
Yeah, statewide, April's the windiest month by far. We could still see higher maximums later in the year, but we just average the most wind. And that can cut off pretty quickly if we get a dominant high pressure building in that doesn't allow for frequent storm systems. But as long as we keep an active pattern and system after system like we have had, we'll see strong winds continue. But then when we get into May, we see that really drop off as the jet stream starts to shift further north, takes that storm track further north, and we get weaker systems and more high pressure periods.
Sure. So through the rest of this month, still be cognizant of some fire weather conditions to be wary of?
Yeah, we have seen a brief bump up and green up, especially in the southeast where they did see moisture in the last week. That should help things along there a little bit. But overall, with the dry conditions we have in the western and central part of the state, I think that we're going to need moisture before we actually see green. And until we get that green, we are going to have fire weather concerns anytime the wind comes up. And especially when we get lower humidities like we have had the last few days. And we'll see fire weather concerns through the weekend with breezy winds, but no big prominent storm system that is typically the indicator of potential for fire outbreaks.
Absolutely. Well, great insight today, Chip. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond rounding out this week's programming with our agricultural weather report. We'll be back with more on Monday on Agriculture Today.